Colorado Territory, 1885. The dust from the trail still clung to Jack Barton's clothes as he guided his horse through the narrow streets of Silver Creek. At 25, he'd spent more years driving cattle than most men twice his age, and the harsh frontier had etched itself into the corners of his eyes, not with wrinkles, but with a wariness that made him seem older than his years. His clean-shaven face and strong jawline belied the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones after 3 months on a cattle drive. Jack believed one thing with absolute certainty: the frontier demanded solitude. Connections meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got a man killed. He'd learned this lesson watching his father die defending their small homestead from bandits when he was just 14. His mother had followed shortly after, broken by grief. The lesson was simple: love was a luxury the West did not permit. A man survived alone or not at all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Jack dismounted in front of the general store. He needed supplies before heading back to his small plot of land outside town, a place he refused to call home, for homes were things to be lost, just a place to rest between jobs. "Afternoon, Mr. Barton," said the shopkeeper, an older man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose. "Haven't seen you since you left with the Blackwater herd." "Just got back," Jack replied, his voice rough from disuse. 3 months with only cattle and a handful of other cowboys had left him unaccustomed to conversation. "Well, welcome back. Town's been lively. New schoolteacher arrived while you were gone. Pretty young thing. And that fancy fellow from back east bought the old Miller property." Jack nodded, uninterested in town gossip. Silver Creek wasn't his community, just the closest trading post to his land. He gathered his supplies quickly, eager to be away from the confines of the town and its people. As he stepped back into the street, the church bell began to toll, its lonely sound echoing through the canyon walls surrounding the small mining town. Sunday service must have just ended. Jack secured his supplies to his horse, working methodically, planning to be back on his land before nightfall. Then he heard it, a soft sound almost lost beneath the shuffle of townspeople making their way home from church: a woman crying. Something in the gentle desperation of those sobs stopped him cold, like a physical force holding him in place. Against his better judgment, Jack turned. Just across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of the white clapboard church's entrance, stood a young woman. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, one gloved hand pressed against the doorframe for support, the other clutching a handkerchief to her lips. She wore a pale blue dress that complemented her slender frame, her honey blonde hair pinned beneath a small hat adorned with a single ribbon. For a moment Jack considered continuing with his business. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. But then the young woman looked up, seeming to sense his gaze, and Jack found himself unable to look away from the raw pain in her eyes. Her face was striking, not merely beautiful, but alive with a kind of expressiveness that made her grief all the more poignant. Tear tracks marked her flushed cheeks, and when their eyes met across the dusty street, Jack felt something shift inside him, like ground giving way beneath his boots. "Miss Zeller, wait please," a man's voice called from inside the church, urgent and demanding. The young woman stiffened, her eyes darting back toward the church door with unmistakable fear. Without conscious decision, Jack found himself stepping away from his horse and crossing the street toward her. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "is everything all right?" She wiped hastily at her tears. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, but her voice trembled, betraying her words. The church door opened behind her and a well-dressed man emerged, his expression darkening when he saw Jack. He was older, perhaps 40, with a trimmed beard and expensive clothes that marked him as not from these parts. "Rebecca," the man said, his tone honeyed but with an undercurrent of steel. "We haven't finished our discussion." Jack noticed how she flinched at the man's voice, how her fingers tightened around her handkerchief until her knuckles whitened. Without planning to, he stepped slightly in front of her, creating a barrier between her and the stranger. "Seems to me the lady's done talking," Jack said, keeping his voice level despite the sudden tension thrumming through him. The man's eyes narrowed. "This is a private matter. I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Barton." Jack Barton, he didn't offer his hand. "Edgar Foster. I recently acquired property in the area." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Zeller and I have business matters to discuss." "Family matters, actually." Jack glanced at the woman, Rebecca Zeller, and saw her almost imperceptibly shake her head. "Maybe another time," Jack suggested, his hand casually moving to rest near his holster. Foster's gaze followed the movement and his smile tightened. Of course, another time. He tipped his hat to Rebecca. We will continue this conversation, my dear. Your father would have wanted the matter resolved quickly. Rebecca said nothing as Foster turned and walked away, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk. Only when he disappeared into the hotel across the street did she release a shaky breath. Thank you, she whispered. You didn't have to do that. Jack shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with his impulsive action. No trouble. I'm Rebecca Zeller, the new schoolteacher. She offered a tremulous smile that transformed her face despite the lingering tears. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 22 or 23. Jack Barton, he cleared his throat. You sure you're all right, Miss Zeller? That fella seemed insistent. Rebecca glanced toward the hotel where Foster had gone. It's complicated. Mr. Foster was my father's business partner in Boston. He claims my father owed him money and that our family property here should rightfully be his. Your family has property near Silver Creek. This surprised Jack. The town was still small and he thought he knew most of the landowners in the area. My father purchased land here years ago, though we never visited. He always talked about moving west when he retired. Her voice softened. He died 3 months ago. I came to claim the property and start a new life, and Mr. Foster followed me here with his claims. Jack nodded slowly. 3 months ago, he'd been leaving on the cattle drive, which explained why he hadn't heard about the new schoolteacher or her situation. He frightens you, Jack observed. Rebecca looked away. He has powerful friends even out here, and I have no one. The words hung between them, and Jack felt an unwelcome pang of empathy. He knew what it meant to have no one. But that was his choice, the way he kept himself safe. Thank you again for your help, Mr. Barton, but I shouldn't keep you any longer. She straightened her shoulders, visibly composing herself. Jack should have tipped his hat, wished her well, and returned to his horse. Instead, he found himself asking, Can I walk you home, Miss Zeller? She looked up at him with surprise. I live at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. It's not far. All the same, he offered his arm without fully understanding why. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her gloved hand on his arm. Thank you. As they walked down the street, Jack could feel Foster watching from the hotel window. Something about the man's interest in Rebecca seemed wrong, predatory. Jack had met men like him before, men who used papers and contracts to take what they wanted just as surely as outlaws used guns. How long do you plan to stay in Silver Creek? Rebecca asked, breaking into his thoughts. Just passing through. I have a small place outside town. You're not a cowboy, she glanced at his trail-worn clothes. I work cattle drives when they need hands. Rest of the time I keep to myself. That sounds lonely, she said softly. Jack stiffened. It's safer that way. They reached the boarding house, a 2-story building with a small garden out front. Rebecca turned to face him, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. Thank you again, Mr. Barton. Perhaps I'll see you around town. Perhaps, he said, though he had no intention of returning to Silver Creek any sooner than necessary. As he walked back to his horse, Jack told himself he'd done his good deed for the year. Rebecca Zeller's problems with Edgar Foster weren't his concern. The frontier was harsh on everyone, and she'd have to learn to fight her own battles just as he had. But as he rode out of town, Jack couldn't shake the image of her tears or the fear in her eyes when Foster had appeared. And for the first time in years, his isolated cabin didn't seem like the refuge it had always been. It was nearly 2 weeks later when Jack returned to Silver Creek. He told himself he needed more supplies, though his pantry wasn't empty. The real reason pulled at the back of his mind, unwelcome but persistent, concern for the schoolteacher with honey-blonde hair and troubled eyes. The town seemed unusually active for a Tuesday afternoon. As Jack tied his horse outside the general store, the owner, Mr. Peterson, hurried out to greet him. Jack, good timing. We're having a town meeting at noon. You might want to attend. Not interested in town business, Jack replied, but Peterson shook his head. This concerns everyone with property around Silver Creek. That eastern fellow, Foster, is claiming water rights to half the streams in the territory. Says he has documents signed by the territorial governor. Jack frowned. How's he figure that? Claims he and his partner bought up old Spanish land grants that included water rights. Most folks are saying it's hogwash, but he's got a fancy lawyer from Denver backing him up. A suspicion formed in Jack's mind. This partner of his, would that be Rebecca Zeller's father? Peterson nodded eagerly. That's right, the schoolteacher's father. Foster claims they were in business together, buying up land and rights all through the West. Says now that the old man's dead, he's the sole owner. The shopkeeper leaned closer. Between you and me, Miss Zeller's been saying her father would never have agreed to what Foster's claiming. Jack's jaw tightened. Where's this miting? Town Hall, noon sharp. The town hall, little more than a large room above the sheriff's office, was packed by the time Jack arrived. He stood at the back, his tall frame allowing him to see over most of the crowd. Rebecca was near the front, her back straight and her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked composed but pale, her blue dress a stark contrast to the sea of drab work clothes surrounding her. Mayor Collins, a former miner who had struck it rich and now owned the largest saloon in town, called the meeting to order. Folks, we're here to discuss the claims made by Mr. Edgar Foster regarding water rights in our region. Foster stood immaculate in a tailored suit that would have cost Jack 6 months' wages. Thank you, Mayor. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns. Change is always difficult. But I assure you, my claims are legal and binding. He gestured to a thin man beside him. My attorney, Mr. Gladwell, has verified the documents. My late partner, Jonathan Zeller, and I acquired these rights legally. I'm simply exercising my rightful claim. Rebecca rose to her feet. That's not true, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Jack could see in her hands. My father would never have agreed to buying up water rights to hold ranchers and farmers hostage. Foster's smile didn't waver. My dear Rebecca, grief can cloud one's judgment. Your father was a businessman, first and foremost. These papers bear his signature. He held up a document. May I see those papers? Asked Sheriff Taylor, a grizzled man who had kept peace in Silver Creek for 15 years. Foster handed them over with apparent confidence. The sheriff studied them, frowning. These look in order, but I'm no lawyer, he admitted. Seems to me this affects everyone who uses water from Cottonwood Creek and its tributaries. A murmur ran through the crowd. Jack realized with a jolt that his small property relied on a spring that fed into Cottonwood Creek. If Foster's claims were valid, he could control who had access to water, the lifeblood of any frontier property. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Foster? Asked Jeremiah Baker, one of the largest ranchers in the area. Simply that water usage be properly regulated and paid for, Foster replied smoothly. A reasonable fee for reasonable use. Those who can't pay, he shrugged. Well, I'm sure arrangements can be made. This is theft, Rebecca exclaimed. You're trying to steal not just my inheritance but the livelihoods of everyone in this room. Foster's expression hardened for a brief moment before the practiced smile returned. Rebecca, please, your father left considerable debts. The property he promised you is worthless without the water rights. I've offered to buy it from you at a fair price, more than fair, considering the circumstances. I don't believe you, she said firmly. And I don't believe these papers are legitimate. Foster's attorney stepped forward. The territorial court will decide that, Miss Zeller. We've already filed our claim. The meeting dissolved into heated arguments after that. Jack watched as Rebecca stood her ground, facing Foster's smooth assertions with increasing frustration. When the gathering finally broke up 2 hours later, nothing had been resolved except that Foster would proceed with his claim in the territorial court, and anyone who wanted to challenge it would need to do so legally. Jack waited outside the town hall, watching as people filed out. Rebecca was among the last to leave, her face drawn with worry. Miss Zeller, he called softly. She looked up, surprise giving way to recognition. Mr. Barton. I didn't expect to see you here. Heard there was trouble, seems I heard right. She glanced around and lowered her voice. He's lying. My father would never have been involved in something like this. The property he left me, it's a small ranch south of town. Father bought it years ago, planning for us to move west someday. And the water rights. I don't believe Father ever purchased water rights, Mr. Foster is trying to scare me into selling my property cheaply, and apparently trying to extort money from everyone else in the process. Jack nodded slowly. Town folks seem concerned. They should be. If Foster succeeds, he'll control whether people can water their livestock or irrigate their crops. He'll own Silver Creek in all but name. Jack had spent years avoiding entanglements of any kind, but something about Rebecca's determination stirred him. "Do you have a copy of your father's will? Any papers showing what he actually owned?" "Some, not enough, apparently." She hesitated. "Mr. Barton, you don't need to involve yourself in my troubles."
"Jack," he said. "My name's Jack."
A small smile curved her lips. "Jack then, and I'm Rebecca." Her smile faded. "But my point stands, this isn't your fight. Seems like it might be everyone's fight if Foster's claiming rights to the water we all use." He paused. "I have a small place that relies on a spring feeding into Cottonwood Creek." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "So you do have a stake in this?" "Appears so." He wasn't ready to admit, even to himself, that his interest had formed the moment he'd seen her crying in the church doorway. "I'm heading to my place now, but I'll be back in town tomorrow. Maybe we could look over those papers you have." Hope brightened her face. "That would be very kind of you."
"Not kindness."
"Self-interest," he corrected, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. As he rode home that evening, Jack tried to convince himself he was simply protecting his property, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. The vulnerability in Rebecca's eyes had awakened something in him, something he'd thought long dead after years of deliberate isolation. The next day, Jack returned to town earlier than necessary. He found Rebecca at the small schoolhouse, just as the children were being dismissed for the day. She smiled when she saw him waiting outside, and that smile did something peculiar to his chest, a tightening he couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. "You came back," she said, her voice colored with surprise despite their arrangement. "Said I would." He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Those papers you mentioned." "Yes, of course, they're at my boarding house. Would you mind walking with me there?" As they walked down the main street, Jack was acutely aware of the glances they drew. Silver Creek was small enough that the new schoolteacher walking with the reclusive rancher would spark gossip. He told himself he didn't care what people thought. "How long have you been teaching?" he asked, searching for safe conversation. "This is my first position, actually. I trained in Boston, but after Father died," she trailed off. "I needed a fresh start. When I learned he owned property here, it seemed like a sign."
"You plan to keep the ranch and teach?"
"That was my hope, hire someone to work the land while I teach. Eventually," she hesitated. "Eventually, I thought I might marry, have a family there. It's beautiful land. Have you seen it?"
Jack shook his head.
"Never had reason to ride south of town much. It's just beyond Miller's Creek, 10 acres with a small house. Nothing grand, but," her eyes softened, "when I first saw it, I could understand why Father bought it. You can see the mountains to the west, and the sunrise over the eastern ridge is breathtaking." There was such longing in her voice that Jack found himself wondering what it would be like to see that sunrise with her. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome, and he pushed it aside quickly. At the boarding house, Rebecca led him to a small parlor reserved for residents to receive visitors. Mrs. Holloway, the proprietress, made a point of passing through twice while they examined the papers Rebecca had brought from Boston. "This is all I have," Rebecca said, laying out several documents on the table. "Father's will, leaving the Silver Creek property to me, the deed to the land itself, some letters about the purchase from 15 years ago." Jack studied them carefully. No mention of water rights in any of these.
"No, mister."
"Foster claims those were purchased separately through their partnership." She frowned. "I knew Father's business involved land deals, but he never mentioned buying water rights or anything that would harm communities." Jack picked up one of the letters, reading carefully. "Says here your father bought the land from a man named Martinez, Spanish land grant, originally." Rebecca nodded. "Yes, that's right. The Martinez family owned large tracts before the territory became American."
Something nagged at Jack's memory.
"Martinez, there's an old rancher south of here, Carlos Martinez. Wonder if he's related." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Do you think he might know something about the original sale?"
"Worth asking."
Jack gathered the papers carefully. "I know where his place is, could ride out there tomorrow." "I'll come with you," Rebecca said immediately. Jack frowned. "It's a long ride."
"It's Saturday."
"No school," her chin lifted in a way that suggested argument would be futile. "It's my land, my father's reputation at stake. I'm coming." Despite himself, Jack felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "All right then. I'll bring a horse for you. Meet me at the livery at dawn." When Rebecca arrived at the livery the next morning, Jack was surprised to see her dressed practically in a split riding skirt and sturdy boots. Her hair was braided and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried a small pack with what he assumed was food for the journey. "You've ridden before," he observed, helping her mount the gentle mare he'd borrowed for her. "Father made sure I learned. He said every proper Boston girl should know how to sit a horse, though I doubt he meant for frontier riding." She settled comfortably in the saddle, "But I've been practicing since I arrived.
This country requires it."
They rode south out of Silver Creek as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the landscape in gold and rose. Jack found himself watching Rebecca's reaction to the beauty around them, the way her eyes widened at a hawk soaring overhead, how she smiled at wildflowers dotting the prairie. "It's different from Boston," she said when she caught him looking. "Better or worse?" She considered this seriously. "Different. Boston has its own beauty, the harbor at sunrise, the public garden in spring. But this," she gestured to the vast landscape, "this feels endless, like you could ride forever and never see the same view twice."
"That's part of its danger," Jack said, "and its appeal. Is that why you stay out here? The endlessness of it."
The question cut too close to truths Jack preferred not to examine. "I stay because it's what I know." They rode in companionable silence after that, Jack occasionally pointing out landmarks or naming plants and animals they passed. By midday, they had reached the Martinez Ranch, a modest spread with a well-maintained adobe house and several outbuildings. An older man with weathered skin and silver-streaked black hair was working in a corral when they rode up. He watched their approach with interest, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. "Carlos Martinez," Jack called as they drew near. "Who's asking?" The man's English was perfect with just a hint of accent. "Jack Barton, this is Miss Rebecca Zeller. We're hoping to ask you about some land you might have sold years back." Martinez studied them carefully before nodding. "Dismount and water your horses. We can talk inside." The interior of the adobe house was cool and comfortable, with hand-woven rugs on the floors and family portraits on the walls. Martinez's wife, Elena, brought them coffee before retiring to give them privacy. "So, Miss Zeller," Martinez said, "what land are we discussing?" "A small ranch beyond Miller's Creek," Rebecca replied. "My father, Jonathan Zeller, purchased it from someone named Martinez about 15 years ago." Recognition flickered in the old rancher's eyes. "Ah, yes, that would have been my cousin Miguel's property."
10 acres with the small house. Yes, that's it.
"I remember when Miguel sold it. He was moving to California and needed the money." Martinez sipped his coffee. "But why are you asking about this now?" Rebecca explained about Foster's claims and the water rights dispute. As she spoke, Martinez's expression grew increasingly troubled. "This is not right," he said firmly when she had finished. "The water rights for that creek have always been communal. My family never claimed exclusive rights, even when we owned 10 times the land we do now." "Foster claims he has documents proving otherwise," Jack said. Martinez shook his head. "The original Spanish grant included water usage, yes, but not ownership of the water itself. That would be like owning the air." He set down his cup. "Miss Zeller, I knew your father, though only through letters. He was an honorable man. He wrote to ask about the history of the land before buying it. He wanted to be sure there were no disputes or claims that might arise later." Rebecca's eyes brightened. "You corresponded with my father. Do you still have those letters?"
"Perhaps."
"My wife keeps such things." Martinez called to his wife in Spanish, and after a brief conversation, she disappeared into another room. She returned moments later with a small wooden box. "These are all the business papers from the old sales," she said, placing it on the table. It took nearly an hour of searching, but finally Martinez held up a yellowed envelope. "Here. From Jonathan Zeller, dated 1870. He carefully extracted the letter and read it silently before handing it to Rebecca. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the paper bearing her father's handwriting. "He specifically asks about water rights," she said after reading it, "and about any partnerships or claims that might affect the property." Martinez nodded, and my cousin's reply, "Here it is," states clearly that water rights are communal by tradition and territorial law. "Your father was very thorough, Miss Zeller. He wanted to be sure the land he bought for his daughter's future was free of complications." Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. "He planned this for me all along." He mentioned a daughter who might someday teach in the West, Martinez confirmed gently. Jack watched the emotions play across Rebecca's face: grief, love, determination, something twisted in his chest, an ache that was almost physical. "Mr. Martinez," he said, pulling his attention away from Rebecca, "would you be willing to make a statement to the territorial court about this? About the water rights being communal?" "Of course. And I can bring other old families who will say the same. This Foster is trying to claim something that was never for sale." As they prepared to leave, Martinez handed Rebecca a small packet of letters. "These are all the correspondence between your father and my family. Take them, they belong with you now." The ride back to Silver Creek was quieter, both of them lost in thought. The sun was beginning to set, painting the landscape in deepening gold, when Rebecca suddenly reined in her horse. "Jack," she said, pointing to a small rise, "that's it, that's my land." He followed her gaze to a modest ranch nestled against a hillside. A small house stood surrounded by several cottonwood trees, with a creek, presumably Miller's Creek, winding through the property. "Would you mind?" she asked. "I'd like to stop there. I've only visited once since arriving in Silver Creek." They rode down to the property in the fading light. The house was simple but solidly built, a two-room cabin with a covered porch and a stone chimney. Rebecca dismounted and walked slowly around the exterior, running her hand along the rough-hewn logs. "Father never saw it finished," she said softly. "He bought the land, commissioned the house, but never made the journey west himself." She looked up at Jack. "Isn't that strange, to love a place you've never seen?" "Maybe he loved the idea of it," Jack suggested, "the promise." Rebecca nodded, then moved to unlock the door. "Would you like to see inside?" The interior was dusty but well-made, with two rooms separated by a partial wall. A stone fireplace dominated one end, and windows let in the last golden light of sunset. Simple furniture, a table, chairs, a bed frame, waited for life to return. "It needs work," Rebecca admitted, "but it could be a home." Jack found himself imagining it as she must see it: curtains at the windows, a fire in the hearth, the smell of cooking. For the first time in years, the image of a real home, not just shelter, didn't fill him with dread. "It's good land," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Good water. You could raise a few cattle, some horses." "That's what I've been thinking," she replied. "Hire someone to work the land while I teach. Eventually." She trailed off, then turned to look directly at him. "Thank you for coming with me today. For helping me fight for this." The gratitude in her eyes made him uncomfortable. "Haven't done much yet." "You've done more than anyone else in Silver Creek. Most people are too afraid of Foster to openly oppose him." The light was nearly gone now, the room filling with shadows. "We should head back," Jack said. "Not safe to ride these trails after dark." They were halfway back to town when they heard hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the direction of Silver Creek. Jack instinctively moved his horse closer to Rebecca's, his hand dropping to his pistol. A rider appeared around the bend, pushing his horse hard. When he saw them, he reined in sharply. Jack recognized him as one of the stable boys from the livery. "Miss Zeller, Mr. Barton," the boy called, breathless. "Sheriff sent me to find you. There's trouble in town." "What kind of trouble?" Jack demanded. "Foster's men tried to block off access to the creek where it runs through town. Said nobody could water their stock there anymore without paying. There was a fight. Mr. Baker's son got hurt bad." Rebecca gasped. "Thomas Baker? He's only 16. "Yes, ma'am. Sheriff's got Foster's men locked up, but Foster himself is threatening legal action against the whole town. Says he's within his rights." Jack exchanged a glance with Rebecca. "Tell the sheriff we're on our way. Tell him Miss Zeller has evidence that might help." As they rode hard towards Silver Creek, Jack could feel a tension building in his chest. He'd spent years avoiding other people's fights, keeping his head down, staying safe in his isolation. But now he was riding straight into a conflict that could cost him everything, and he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The main street of Silver Creek was unnaturally crowded for evening, with knots of angry men gathered outside the sheriff's office and the saloon. Jack helped Rebecca dismount in front of the sheriff's office, acutely aware of the eyes turning toward them. Sheriff Taylor met them at the door, his weathered face grim. "Miss Zeller, Barton, heard you might have something that could help with this mess." Rebecca clutched the packet of letters. We visited Carlos Martinez today. He has evidence that the water rights Foster is claiming never existed. The sheriff ushered them inside, where Mayor Collins and several town council members were already gathered. Edgar Foster sat in a chair near the sheriff's desk, looking unruffled despite the tension filling the room. "Ah, Rebecca," Foster said smoothly, "I was wondering where you disappeared to, out riding with Mr. Barton, I see." His gaze slid to Jack with barely disguised contempt. "How rustic." "Mr. Foster," Rebecca replied coldly, "I've just come from speaking with Carlos Martinez, whose cousin sold my father the property. He confirms that water rights were never part of any sale. They've always been communal by both tradition and law." Foster's smile didn't waver, hearsay from an interested party. "My documents, on the other hand, are properly filed with the territorial government." "Documents can be forged," Jack said quietly. The room fell silent at his words. Foster's smile hardened into something dangerous. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Barton." Jack held his gaze steadily. "Yes, it is." Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat. "Miss Zeller, what exactly did you find out today?" Rebecca carefully laid out the letters on the sheriff's desk. "My father specifically asked about water rights before purchasing the property. Mr. Martinez's cousin confirmed in writing that water rights were communal and could not be sold separately. Furthermore, Mr. Martinez remembered my father as an honorable man who would never have engaged in the kind of scheme Mr. Foster is describing." "That's your proof," Foster scoffed. "Old letters and fond memories." "My partnership agreement with your father, duly witnessed and signed, gives me clear title to the water rights." "May I see this partnership agreement again?" Rebecca asked. "I'd like to examine my father's signature more carefully." Foster hesitated fractionally before nodding to his lawyer, who produced the document from his case. Rebecca studied it intently before looking up, her eyes bright with certainty. "This is not my father's signature," she declared. "I have dozens of examples of his handwriting, including these letters to Mr. Martinez. The signature on this partnership agreement is forged." Foster's lawyer stepped forward. "That's a reckless claim, Miss Zeller. The document was notarized in Boston." "By a notary you paid," Jack suggested. "The territorial court will determine the validity of these documents," the lawyer insisted. Mayor Collins, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "That may be so, but in the meantime, no one in Silver Creek will be paying for water that's always been free for the taking. And your men, Mr. Foster, will remain in jail until they answer for their assault on young Thomas Baker." Foster's composure cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake, all of you. I have powerful friends in the territorial government." "Maybe so," Sheriff Taylor said, "but out here, we still believe in right and wrong. And trying to steal a town's water supply falls pretty clearly on the wrong side." The meeting continued for another hour, with tempers flaring and threats exchanged. Eventually, it was agreed that Foster's claims would be suspended until the territorial court could review all evidence, including Martinez's testimony and the letters Rebecca had discovered. As they finally left the sheriff's office, the night air cool against their faces, Rebecca turned to Jack. "It's not over, is it?" "No," he admitted. "Foster won't give up easily." She sighed, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "At least we've bought some time. Thank you, Jack. I couldn't have done this without you." He wanted to say it was nothing, that he'd have done the same for anyone, but they both knew it wasn't true. Something had changed in him since seeing her crying in the church doorway, a wall beginning to crumble after years of careful construction. "I'll walk you to your boarding house," was all he said. As they walked, Rebecca spoke quietly. "Foster will try something else. He's not the kind of man who accepts defeat." "No," Jack agreed. "Men like that usually don't. I should probably have someone stay at my property. I'm worried he might try to damage it somehow, to force me to sell." Jack hesitated before saying, "I could check on it for you. My place isn't far." She looked up at him with such gratitude that it made his chest tighten again. "Would you? I'd feel better knowing someone was keeping an eye on it." They reached her boarding house too quickly. Standing on the porch, with the soft glow of lamps from inside illuminating her face, Rebecca looked both strong and vulnerable, a combination that called to something deep inside Jack.
Good night, Jack, she said softly, and thank you again. He touched the brim of his hat. Good night, Rebecca. As he walked back to the livery to collect his horse for the ride home, Jack realized that for the first time in years, his isolated cabin held no appeal. The thought of returning to its empty rooms, with only silence for company, left him feeling hollow in a way he'd never noticed before. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jack found himself riding into Silver Creek more frequently than he had in years, ostensibly to check on developments with Foster's case, but inevitably finding his way to the schoolhouse or Rebecca's boarding house. He began checking on her property regularly, sometimes making small repairs to the cabin or clearing brush around the structure. Foster remained in town, a constant threatening presence despite the setback to his plans. His men had been released from jail after paying fines, and they could often be seen watching the schoolhouse or following Rebecca at a distance when she walked through town. One Wednesday afternoon, Jack arrived at the schoolhouse just as the children were being dismissed. Rebecca smiled when she saw him, a smile that seemed to grow warmer each time they met. Jack, I wasn't expecting you today. Was in town anyway, he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Thought I'd let you know I fixed that loose shutter at your place. Thank you, she gathered her books and papers. Would you like some tea? Mrs. Holloway always has a pot ready in the afternoons. They walked together toward the boarding house, falling into the easy conversation that had developed between them. Jack found himself talking more than he had in years, about his small ranch, his years working cattle drives, even a little about his parents and the tragedy that had shaped his view of the frontier. So that's why you keep to yourself, Rebecca said gently when he mentioned his father's death. You believe connections make you vulnerable. Put so plainly, his philosophy of isolation suddenly seemed flimsy, even foolish. It's just safer, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Rebecca stopped walking and turned to face him. Is it really, though? Safer to have no one to turn to when trouble comes, no one to share the burden or watch your back, she shook her head. That doesn't sound safer to me, Jack, it just sounds lonely. Before he could respond, a shout from down the street drew their attention. A crowd was gathering outside the telegraph office, voices raised in alarm. What now? Jack muttered, instinctively moving closer to Rebecca as they approached the commotion. Mayor Collins was reading from a telegram, his face flushed with anger. When he saw Jack and Rebecca, he waved them over. Just got word from Denver, he announced grimly. Foster's filed for an injunction against the entire town, claiming we're interfering with his legal water rights. Judge has granted a temporary order until a hearing next month. What does that mean? Rebecca asked. It means we're officially prohibited from disputing his claims until the hearing. If we disobey, the territorial marshal could be sent in. The mayor crumpled the telegram in his fist. That snake must have friends in high places indeed. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the crowd. Jack watched Rebecca's face pale, then set with determination. This changes nothing, she declared loudly enough for those nearby to hear. The truth is still the truth. His documents are forged and we can prove it. Careful, Miss Zeller, came a smooth voice from the edge of the crowd. Edgar Foster stepped forward, impeccably dressed as always. Such accusations could be considered slander. I'd hate to add that to my complaints against you. Jack moved slightly in front of Rebecca, a gesture that wasn't lost on Foster. Your cowboy protector again, Foster observed with a thin smile. How touching, but even he can't protect you from the law, my dear. The law serves justice, Rebecca replied firmly. Eventually that will work against you, not for you. Foster's smile never wavered. We'll see. In the meantime, I've made a reasonable offer for your property. My attorney has the papers ready whenever you decide to be sensible. He tipped his hat and walked away, his lawyer trailing behind him. The crowd dispersed slowly, people breaking into worried conversations about what the injunction might mean for their water access. Jack stayed close to Rebecca, noting the slight tremor in her hands despite her brave words. Are you all right? He asked quietly when they were relatively alone again. No, she admitted. I'm terrified. Foster has money and influence I can't match. What if he wins? He won't, Jack said with more confidence than he felt. We have the truth on our side. Is that enough out here? She looked up at him, her eyes seeking reassurance he wasn't sure he could honestly give. Sometimes it is, he said, and sometimes you need more, people willing to stand with you, friends. She smiled faintly. Are you my friend, Jack Barton? The question seemed to ask for more than its simple words implied. Jack found himself standing at a crossroads he'd avoided for years, the choice between safe isolation and risky connection. Yes, he said finally, I am. The next morning, Jack rode to the Martinez ranch again, this time alone. He found Carlos working in his vegetable garden, Elena sitting nearby shelling peas. Barton, Carlos greeted him, wiping his hands on his trousers. I heard about Foster's injunction. Bad business. That's why I'm here, Jack said. We need more than just letters. We need proof that Foster's documents are forged. Carlos nodded thoughtfully. The signatures, you mean? And the notary. If we could prove the notary was bribed or didn't actually witness the signatures. That would be in Boston, Carlos pointed out, a long way from here. Yes, but there might be other inconsistencies, dates that don't match up. References to places or agreements that never existed. Jack paused. Do you still have connections with other old families who sold land around here? People who might have dealt with Zeller or Foster. Some, the Riveras still own land north of here. And old Joaquin Mendoza, he's in his 80s now, but his mind is sharp. He kept records of every transaction involving the original Spanish grants. Can you arrange meetings with them? Carlos studied Jack's face. You're going to a lot of trouble for the schoolteacher, Barton. Jack didn't deny it. Foster's claims affect everyone with property around Silver Creek, not just Miss Zeller. Carlos didn't look convinced. Elena, what do you think? Should we help Mr. Barton court the pretty schoolteacher? Elena smiled knowingly. I think any man who rides 20 miles to protect a woman's inheritance has already declared his intentions, whether he admits it or not. Jack felt heat rise in his face. It's not like that, he protested weakly. Carlos and Elena exchanged amused glances. Of course not, Carlos said. Well, in any case, I'll send word to the Riveras and Mendoza. We can meet at my place the day after tomorrow. Bring Miss Zeller, they'll want to hear her story directly. As Jack rode back towards Silver Creek, he found himself confronting feelings he'd been trying to ignore. Was Elena right? Were his actions about more than just helping a neighbor or protecting his water rights? The answer was uncomfortable but increasingly undeniable. He arrived in town by mid-afternoon and headed straight to the schoolhouse. Through the window, he could see Rebecca working at her desk while a few children practiced their letters on the blackboard. She looked up as if sensing his presence, and the smile that lit her face at the sight of him sent an unmistakable warmth through his chest. Yes, he admitted to himself, it was definitely more than neighborly concern. After school dismissed, Jack told Rebecca about the meeting with the old families. They might have information that could help prove Foster's documents are fraudulent. That's wonderful, Jack, she said, genuine hope in her voice for the first time in days. When do we go? Day after tomorrow, I'll come for you at dawn, he hesitated. In the meantime, I'm concerned about you staying at the boarding house alone. Foster seems to be escalating his efforts, and his men have been watching you. Rebecca frowned. What alternative is there? You could stay at your property. I could keep watch from my place nearby. She considered this. Mrs. Holloway would be scandalized. We could ask Mrs. Martinez to stay with you as a chaperone, Jack suggested. Her presence would satisfy propriety, and Carlos would feel better knowing his wife was safely away from any trouble that might come to town. It was a sensible solution, but Jack found himself strangely disappointed when Rebecca readily agreed. He told himself it was ridiculous to feel that way. He'd suggested the arrangement himself, after all. The next day, Jack helped Rebecca move a few necessities to her property, then rode to the Martinez ranch to escort Elena back. The older woman seemed delighted with the arrangement, chattering happily about how she would help make the cabin more comfortable. It needs a woman's touch, she declared upon seeing the sparse interior. Some curtains, proper bedding, cooking utensils. Jack left them settling in, with a promise to return the next morning for their journey to meet with the other families. As he rode the short distance to his own small cabin, he reflected on how quickly his solitary existence had been upended. A month ago, he would have balked at the idea of involving himself in someone else's problems, let alone spending days riding around the territory gathering evidence. Yet here he was, and strangest of all, he didn't regret it.
For the first time in years, he felt a purpose beyond mere survival. The walls he'd built around himself were crumbling, and though it terrified him, it also filled him with an unfamiliar hope. The meeting with the old Spanish families the next day proved more fruitful than Jack had dared hope. Joaquin Mendoza, a wizened man with sharp eyes and an encyclopedic memory, produced land records dating back 50 years. He spread them carefully on Carlos Martinez's dining table, pointing with a gnarled finger to entries that contradicted Foster's claims. "Here," he said in accented English. The water rights for Cottonwood Creek and its tributaries were specifically reserved as communal in the original territorial survey of 1855. No private ownership was ever granted, not even under Spanish law before that. Rebecca leaned forward eagerly. "So my father couldn't have purchased water rights even if he'd wanted to." "Exactly so, señorita. The water belongs to all who live along its course. This has been our way since before your American government came." The Rivera family provided another crucial piece of evidence. Foster had approached them 5 years earlier, attempting to buy their land with similar claims about water rights. They had refused and later heard rumors that he had tried the same tactics in other territories. "He is what you call a con man," Maria Rivera said firmly. "He finds properties he wants, then invents legal claims to pressure the owners to sell cheaply." By late afternoon, they had compiled a substantial body of evidence contradicting Foster's claims. Jack watched Rebecca's confidence grow with each new revelation, her natural intelligence shining as she connected pieces of information into a coherent case against Foster. As they prepared to leave, Carlos pulled Jack aside. "Foster is not a man who gives up easily. Be careful. Men like that become dangerous when cornered." "We will be," Jack assured him. They rode back toward Silver Creek as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Rebecca was animated, discussing their findings and planning how to present them at the hearing in Denver. "With Mr. Mendoza's records alone, we can prove Foster's claims are baseless," she said, "and if we can get the territorial surveyor to testify about the communal water rights designation." Jack smiled at her enthusiasm but remained vigilant, scanning the landscape as they rode. The territory might be beautiful, but he knew better than most how danger could lurk behind that beauty. They were within sight of Rebecca's property when Jack noticed something wrong. A thin plume of smoke rose from the direction of the cabin, too much smoke for a simple cooking fire. "Rebecca," he said sharply, interrupting her planning, "look." She followed his gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. "Alina. She's alone at the cabin." Without waiting for Jack, Rebecca urged her horse into a gallop toward the smoke. Jack quickly overtook her, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. As they crested the small rise overlooking the property, his worst fears were confirmed. The cabin was engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly to the surrounding grass. "Alina," Rebecca screamed, pushing her horse faster. They reached the burning building to find Alina outside, coughing but alive, her face streaked with soot. An overturned lantern lay in the dirt nearby. "Thanks be to God you've come," Alina gasped. "2 men, they came asking for you, Miss Zeller. When I said you weren't here, they knocked me aside and poured something on the floors. Then they lit the lantern and threw it inside." Jack's blood ran cold. "Foster's men." Elena nodded weakly. "I recognized one from town, the tall one who follows Foster everywhere." Rebecca was already tearing strips from her petticoat, wetting them in the nearby creek to wrap around Alina's burned hands. "We need to get her to a doctor," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Jack looked at the burning cabin, now beyond saving, then back at the women. "I'll take you both to town. We'll get the sheriff on the way." As they rode toward Silver Creek, Alina secured on Jack's horse in front of him while Rebecca followed. Jack felt a rage building inside him, unlike anything he'd experienced in years. The careful distance he'd maintained from others had been a shield, not just against pain, but against this kind of fury, the kind that came from seeing someone you cared about harmed. Sheriff Taylor was outside his office when they rode into town. One look at Alina's burns and Rebecca's soot-streaked face told him something serious had happened. "Foster's men burned Miss Zeller's cabin," Jack said without preamble. "Mrs. Martinez was inside." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Get Mrs. Martinez to Doc Wilson. I'll round up some men and head out to the fire." He hesitated. Foster and his men rode out this afternoon, said they were heading to Denver early for the hearing. But his foreman, Reeves, is still in town. Find him, Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. This wasn't just property damage. They could have killed Mrs. Martinez. As Jack helped Alina down from his horse in front of the doctor's office, he caught Rebecca looking at him, concern evident in her eyes. Jack, she said softly, promise me you won't do anything foolish. We need to fight Foster legally, not give him more ammunition against us. He wanted to promise, but the rage still simmered too close to the surface. Let's get Alina taken care of first. Dr. Wilson confirmed that Alina's burns, while painful, weren't severe. He applied salve and bandaged her hands, recommending rest and plenty of water. Jack sent a local boy to ride to the Martinez ranch with a message for Carlos, explaining what had happened and assuring him that Alina was safe. By the time they left the doctor's office, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office across the street. Sheriff Taylor was addressing them, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Arson, plain and simple. I've got men out there now trying to contain the fire before it spreads to neighboring properties. He caught sight of Jack and Rebecca and waved them over. Miss Zeller, would you tell these folks what you saw? Rebecca stepped forward, her voice steady as she described finding her cabin in flames and Alina's account of Foster's men deliberately setting the fire. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the crowd. Where's Foster now? Someone called out. On his way to Denver, according to his lawyer, the sheriff replied, but his foreman Reeves is being held in my jail. Claims he knows nothing about it. And you believe him? Jack asked skeptically. Sheriff Taylor gave him a measured look. I believe in due process, Barton, even for men who probably deserve a rope. He turned back to the crowd. I want volunteers to help contain the fire out at Miss Zeller's place, and I want everyone to stay calm. We'll handle this legally. As the crowd dispersed, with several men heading out to fight the fire, Mayor Collins approached Rebecca. Miss Zeller, I'm truly sorry about your property. Where will you stay now? She can stay with us, said Mrs. Peterson, the shopkeeper's wife. We have a spare room and she'll be safe there. Rebecca thanked them gratefully, but Jack could see the devastation in her eyes. The cabin had represented more than just property to her. It was her father's legacy, her future, her dream of a home in the West. The fire doesn't change anything, he told her quietly as they walked toward the Petersons' house. We still have the evidence against Foster. We can still win at the hearing. I know, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It's just, that was all I had of my father. His last gift to me. Tears welled in her eyes, though she fought to hold them back, and now it's gone. Jack felt helpless in the face of her grief, unused to offering comfort. Hesitantly he reached out and took her hand, surprised when she gripped his tightly in return. We'll rebuild it, he said, exactly as it was. She looked up at him, a question in her tear-filled eyes. Wait. The word had slipped out unplanned, but Jack didn't take it back. Yes, if you want. Something shifted in her expression, a flash of hope breaking through the despair. I'd like that, Jack. They reached the Petersons' house too soon, forcing Jack to release her hand. Mrs. Peterson was already fussing over Rebecca, insisting she needed rest and a hot meal after her ordeal. I'll come for you in the morning, Jack said. We should leave for Denver as soon as possible. Foster's already on his way, and I don't trust him not to try something else before the hearing. Rebecca nodded. Thank you, Jack. For everything. As he walked away, Jack realized that the protective walls he'd maintained for so long had completely crumbled. The thought of Rebecca in danger filled him with a fear more profound than anything he'd felt for himself. And strangely, though it made him vulnerable in ways he'd spent years avoiding, it also made him feel more alive than he had since his parents' deaths. The journey to Denver took 3 days of hard riding. Jack remained vigilant, constantly watching for signs of Foster or his men, but they encountered no trouble. Rebecca rode steadily beside him, her determination to see justice done seeming to grow with each mile. They spoke often during the long hours in the saddle. Jack found himself sharing stories of his years on cattle drives, of the beauty and danger he'd witnessed across the frontier. Rebecca told him about her life in Boston, her teaching aspirations, and her complex relationship with her father, a man she had loved but never fully understood until reading his letters to the Martinez family. He wanted me to have a choice, she said as they made camp on the second night. To know there was a place waiting for me in the West if I wanted it, but never to feel obligated to come. She poked at the campfire with a stick. I wonder if he knew, somehow, that I would need it one day. He sounds like a good father, Jack said, thinking of his own father who had died trying to protect his family. Trying to give you a future, whatever happened. Rebecca looked up at him across the fire, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. And what about your future, Jack? What do you want from it? It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. Survival had been his only goal, one day following another in a solitary existence that, until recently, had seemed sufficient. I'm not sure anymore, he admitted. For a long time I just wanted to be left alone, to not feel anything too deeply. He met her gaze. That's changed. Because of Foster and his threats to the water supply, she asked, though her tone suggested she knew that wasn't the whole answer. No, Jack said simply, because of you. The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended but undeniably true. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. I've changed too, she said softly. When I came west, I was running from grief, looking for a fresh start. I never expected to find someone who would make me feel safe in the midst of all this danger. Jack wanted to tell her that he didn't feel safe at all, that caring for her terrified him more than any outlaw's gun. But the vulnerability in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he simply said, we should get some rest, long ride tomorrow. They reached Denver late the following afternoon, the territorial capital bustling with activity that made Silver Creek seem like little more than a quiet outpost. Jack secured rooms for them at a respectable hotel near the courthouse, then went to inform the territorial marshal about the arson and Foster's fraudulent claims. Marshal Dawson, a graying man with shrewd eyes, listened carefully to their story and examined the evidence they'd brought. Foster's a slippery one, he admitted when they'd finished. There have been rumors about his business practices before, but he's always managed to stay just within the law, or at least, to avoid leaving enough evidence to convict him. This time we have proof, Rebecca insisted, pointing to Mendoza's records and the letters from her father. The signatures don't match. The water rights he's claiming never existed. The marshal nodded slowly. I believe you, Miss Zeller, but Foster has friends in the territorial government, people he's wined and dined and possibly bribed. Judge Harmon, who's hearing your case tomorrow, isn't one of them, fortunately. He's as honest as they come, but be prepared for Foster to fight dirty. As they left the marshal's office, Rebecca's earlier confidence seemed somewhat diminished. What if it's not enough, she asked as they walked back toward their hotel. What if he manages to convince the judge somehow? Jack wished he could offer absolute assurance, but the frontier had taught him that justice wasn't always served, even with the best evidence. Then we keep fighting, he said. We appeal, we find more evidence, we don't give up. She smiled at his determination. You keep saying that. Is that a problem? No, she said softly. It's the only thing giving me hope right now. The next morning, they arrived at the courthouse to find it already crowded with spectators. Word of the water rights dispute had apparently spread through Denver, attracting curious onlookers and possibly other landowners concerned about similar claims. Edgar Foster sat at a table near the front, immaculately dressed as always, his lawyer whispering in his ear. When he saw Jack and Rebecca enter, his expression briefly darkened before he composed himself into a mask of confidence. The hearing began with Foster's lawyer presenting their case, a smooth, well-rehearsed argument about partnership agreements, historical water rights, and the legitimate business interests of his client. He presented the documents they had seen before, emphasizing the signatures and the notary's seal. When it was their turn, Rebecca spoke first, her voice clear and steady as she explained her father's purchase of the property and his correspondence with the Martinez family, specifically asking about water rights. Jack then presented Mendoza's records, showing the communal designation of the water rights dating back to the original Spanish grants. Judge Harmon, a stern-faced man with piercing blue eyes, examined each document carefully. These are serious discrepancies, he observed. Mr. Foster, how do you explain the fact that the territorial records clearly show water rights for Cottonwood Creek were designated as communal and could not be privately owned? Foster leaned forward, his confidence unshaken. Your Honor, the original Spanish land grants included water rights that predated territorial designations. My business partner, Jonathan Zeller, and I acquired those rights legally through our purchases." "That is not true," Rebecca interjected. "My father would never have participated in such a scheme, and Mr. Mendoza's records clearly show that even under Spanish law, these particular water rights were communal." The judge frowned. "Miss Zeller also claims that her father's signature on your partnership agreement is forged, Mr. Foster. Do you have any witnesses who actually saw Mr. Zeller sign this document?" Foster's lawyer stepped in smoothly. "The document was properly notarized in Boston, Your Honor. The notary's seal verifies the signature's authenticity." "A notary who has since died conveniently," Jack pointed out. The judge studied both sets of documents again, comparing the signatures on Foster's partnership agreement with those on Jonathan Zeller's letters to the Martinez family. "There are certainly inconsistencies in these signatures," he observed. "But I am not a handwriting expert." Foster's confident smile returned. "Precisely, Your Honor, which is why you should rely on the proper legal documentation, duly notarized and filed with the territorial government." The hearing continued for hours, with arguments and counterarguments about the validity of the documents and the history of water rights in the territory. By late afternoon, Jack could see that Rebecca was exhausted, though she never wavered in her clear, articulate responses to the judge's questions. Finally, Judge Harmon held up his hand. "I've heard enough for today. This is a complex matter that requires careful consideration. I will review all submitted documents overnight and deliver my ruling tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He fixed both parties with a stern gaze. "Until then, the injunction remains in place. Court is adjourned." As they left the courthouse, Jack felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. They had presented their evidence well, but Foster had been persuasive and his documents, though suspect, were officially filed with the territorial government. "What do you think?" Rebecca asked quietly as they walked back toward their hotel. Judge seemed fair. He noticed the signature differences. "But is it enough?" She looked up at him, worry evident in her eyes. Foster was so confident. Before Jack could respond, a voice called out behind them, "Miss Zeller, a moment please." They turned to see Marshal Dawson approaching rapidly, his expression urgent. "Glad I caught you. Something's come up that might interest you." He glanced around the busy street. "Not here, come to my office." At the marshal's office, Dawson closed the door before retrieving a telegram from his desk. "This came in an hour ago from the Boston police. I took the liberty of wiring them about Foster after our conversation yesterday." He handed the telegram to Rebecca, who read it aloud. "Edgar Foster wanted for multiple counts of fraud and document forgery in Massachusetts, in New York stop known to operate with partner Thomas Reeves, stop, both fled Boston ahead of arrest warrants last year stop advise caution, as Foster known to resort to violence when cornered stop." Jack's mind raced. "Reeves, that's Foster's foreman, the one Sheriff Taylor is holding in Silver Creek for the arson." Marshal Dawson nodded grimly. "I'm sending deputies to arrest Foster immediately." "This changes everything." "Will the judge know about this before making his ruling?" Rebecca asked. "I'll make sure of it." The marshal stood. "You two should stay out of sight until Foster's in custody. Men like him are most dangerous when they're desperate." They returned to their hotel by a roundabout route, Jack constantly watching for any sign of Foster or his men. In the hotel lobby, he hesitated. "I should escort you to your room," he said. "Make sure it's secure." Rebecca nodded, clearly shaken by the revelation of Foster's criminal past. When they reached her door, she turned to face him. Would you mind staying for a while, just until we know Foster's been arrested?" Jack knew it wasn't proper, but propriety seemed less important than her safety. Of course. Her room was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking the busy Denver street below. Jack checked the lock on the window and pulled the curtains closed before taking a seat in the room's only chair. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It will be over soon," Jack said, trying to reassure her. "With the Boston telegram, the judge will rule in your favor, and Foster will be arrested." She nodded but didn't look convinced. "Jack, if something happens to me—" "It won't," he interrupted firmly. "But if it does," she insisted, "I want you to know that meeting you, having you beside me through all this, it's meant everything to me." The emotion in her voice made Jack's chest tighten. He wanted to tell her what she meant to him, how she had broken through years of isolation to touch something he thought long dead, but the words felt trapped in his throat, unfamiliar and frightening. Before he could find them, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside, running footsteps and shouting voices. Jack was on his feet instantly, moving to position himself between Rebecca and the door. When someone pounded on the door, he drew his pistol. "Miss Zeller," it was Marshal Dawson's voice. "Are you in there? It's urgent." Jack opened the door cautiously, keeping his gun ready until he confirmed it was indeed the marshal standing there, looking agitated. "Foster's gone," Dawson said without preamble. "My men went to arrest him, but he'd already checked out of his hotel, left in a hurry, according to the clerk." "He knows," Rebecca said, her face pale. "Someone must have warned him about the telegram." "Most likely," the marshal agreed grimly. "I've got men searching the city, but my guess is he's already heading back towards Silver Creek." Jack's blood ran cold at the implication. Why would he go back there? The evidence against him is here, with us. "Revenge, maybe," Dawson suggested, "or he thinks there's still a way to force the town to pay him, injunction or not. Or he's going after Reeves, the only person who can testify against him about the arson," Jack realized. He turned to Rebecca. "We need to get back to Silver Creek." "I've arranged for a special train," the marshal said. "Leaves in 30 minutes. I'll be sending deputies with you. Pack your things quickly." As they hurried to gather their belongings, Jack's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Foster was desperate now, a cornered animal, and cornered animals were always the most dangerous. The train journey back to the station nearest Silver Creek took a fraction of the time their ride to Denver had required, but to Jack, it felt interminable. Every minute Foster had on them was another minute for him to reach Silver Creek and cause God knew what kind of havoc. Rebecca sat beside him in the train car, her face drawn with worry. The two deputies Marshal Dawson had assigned to accompany them sat across from them, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested they shared Jack's concerns about what they might find when they arrived. "What will he do?" Rebecca asked softly as the train clattered through the night. "Foster, I mean, what's his plan?" "Hard to say," Jack admitted. "Depends how desperate he is. Might try to break Reeves out of jail. Might try to salvage something from his scheme before fleeing the territory." One of the deputies, a young man named Cooper, leaned forward. "Marshall thinks he might try to take hostages, force the town to let Reeves go and give him safe passage out of the territory. Or he might simply want revenge," added the other deputy, an older man with a graying mustache. "Men like Foster often can't stand being bested, especially by those they consider beneath them." Rebecca shuddered slightly, and Jack found himself reaching for her hand. She gripped his tightly, drawing strength from the contact. "Whatever he's planning," Jack said, "we'll stop him." They reached the station at dawn, quickly securing horses for the final leg of their journey to Silver Creek. As they rode, Jack kept a watchful eye on the landscape, half expecting to see Foster or his men waiting in ambush. But the trail remained clear all the way to town. Silver Creek appeared peaceful in the early morning light, with only a few people visible on the main street. But Jack sensed something wrong. The town was too quiet, the usual morning activities absent. Sheriff Taylor met them at the edge of town, his face grim. "Glad you're back," he said without preamble. "We've got trouble." "Foster?" Jack asked, already knowing the answer. The sheriff nodded. "Got back late last night with 4 men I haven't seen before. Hired guns by the look of them. They're holed up in the hotel, and Foster's sent word that he wants Reeves released and safe passage out of the territory, or he'll start burning buildings." He glanced at Rebecca, starting with the schoolhouse. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. "The children." "School's canceled today," the sheriff assured her. "I've warned everyone to stay home, but Foster's men are watching all the roads out of town. No one can leave without being seen." The deputies introduced themselves and quickly outlined what they knew about Foster's criminal past. "Marshal Dawson is sending more men," Deputy Cooper explained, "but they won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest." "We can't wait that long," Jack said. "Foster's desperate. If he thinks he's running out of time, there's no telling what he might do." Sheriff Taylor nodded grimly. "I've got a few men I can trust with guns. Between us, the deputies, and a couple of ranchers who were in town when Foster arrived, we might be able to surround the hotel." "And risk a shootout in the middle of town,"
Rebecca objected. People could be killed. She was right, Jack knew. A gunfight in Silver Creek's Main Street would inevitably lead to casualties, possibly among innocent townspeople if any were caught in the crossfire. What about negotiation? Deputy Cooper suggested. Stall him until Marshal Dawson's reinforcements arrive. Worth trying, the sheriff agreed, but Foster's not a fool. He'll know we're playing for time. Jack had been thinking, examining, and discarding options. The hotel has a back entrance through the kitchen, he said slowly. If someone could get in that way while you're talking to Foster out front. The older deputy, Harrison was his name, shook his head. Too risky. Foster will have that covered. Not if you give him something else to focus on, Jack insisted. A distraction big enough to draw all attention to the front of the hotel. Rebecca had been listening intently. Now she straightened in her saddle, a determined look on her face. I could be that distraction. No, Jack said immediately. Absolutely not. Think about it, Jack, she pressed. Foster wants me to sign over my property. He believes I have papers that could still threaten his freedom, even if he escapes the territory, if I offer to negotiate with him directly. It's too dangerous, Jack insisted, but he could see the sheriff and deputies considering the idea. It might work, Sheriff Taylor said slowly. If Foster thinks he can get what he wants without violence, he might be willing to talk. And while he's focused on Miss Zeller, we could get men in through the back, Deputy Cooper added. Jack wanted to object further, but the tactical sense of the plan was undeniable. Still, the thought of Rebecca walking into danger made his stomach knot with fear. I won't be alone, Rebecca said, as if reading his thoughts. You'll all be watching, ready to intervene. She met Jack's eyes. I trust you, Jack. I know you won't let anything happen to me. The simple faith in her words struck him like a physical blow. Trust. How long had it been since anyone had trusted him that way, since he had allowed himself to be worthy of such trust? If we do this, he said finally, we do it carefully, every detail planned. No heroics, he looked at each of them in turn, and at the first sign that Foster might harm her, we move in, regardless of the plan. They spent the next hour developing their strategy. Rebecca would approach the hotel under a flag of truce, offering to negotiate with Foster. Meanwhile, Jack, Deputy Harrison, and two of the sheriff's men would circle around to the hotel's back entrance. Sheriff Taylor, Deputy Cooper, and several townsmen would position themselves along the main street, ready to provide covering fire if needed. As they prepared to put the plan into action, Jack pulled Rebecca aside, his heart pounding with emotions he could no longer deny or ignore. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. We can find another way. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. I need to face him, Jack, for my father's memory. For my future, she smiled faintly. For our future, perhaps. The simple words and all they implied made Jack's breath catch. He covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. Be careful, he whispered. I've only just found you. I can't lose you now. You won't, she promised. Then, with a courage that humbled him, she straightened her shoulders and walked toward the hotel, a white handkerchief held high above her head. Jack watched her go, every instinct screaming at him to stop her, to protect her. But he forced himself to turn away, to focus on his part of the plan. He would be more used to her at the back of the hotel than following her like a shadow. He moved quickly through the alleyways with Deputy Harrison and the sheriff's men, circling around to approach the hotel from behind. As they neared the back entrance, they could hear voices from the kitchen, one of Foster's men, apparently, guarding the rear as they had expected. Jack peered carefully around the corner. A single man stood smoking a cigarette, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. Taking down one guard silently would be possible, but they needed to time it with Rebecca's distraction at the front. When do we move? Whispered one of the sheriff's men, a young deputy named Williams. When we hear Foster talking to Miss Zeller, Deputy Harrison replied. That'll mean he's focused on her, not watching the back. The minutes stretched painfully as they waited, crouched in the narrow space between buildings. Jack's muscles tensed with each passing moment, his mind filled with images of Rebecca facing Foster alone. Then they heard it, Foster's voice, carrying clearly through an open window at the front of the hotel. Miss Zeller. This is an unexpected pleasure. Come to surrender your property at last. Rebecca's reply was too soft to make out, but Foster's laugh was coldly audible.
By all means, let's negotiate. Come inside and we can discuss terms. Jack exchanged glances with the others. This was their signal. Silently, they moved toward the kitchen entrance. The guard had just flicked away his cigarette and was reaching for his rifle when Deputy Harrison stepped around the corner, his gun already drawn. "Don't," he said softly, "unless you want to die today." The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. Williams quickly disarmed him, while Jack and the other deputy slipped past into the kitchen. The hotel cook and a serving girl were huddled in the corner, eyes wide with fear. "How many men with Foster?" Jack asked them in a hushed voice. "4," the cook whispered, "all armed. They're in the dining room with him now." Jack nodded to the back door. "Get out, go to the sheriff's office and stay there." As the kitchen staff fled, Jack and the deputies moved carefully toward the dining room. They could hear Foster's voice more clearly now, the false charm evident even through the closed door. "I'm offering you a very generous deal, Rebecca. Sign over your property, give me the evidence you gathered in Denver, and I'll leave Silver Creek peacefully. No one needs to get hurt." "And if I refuse," Rebecca's voice was remarkably steady, "then I'm afraid I can't be responsible for what happens to this charming little town." Foster's tone hardened. "Starting with that schoolhouse you seem so fond of." Jack positioned himself beside the door, listening intently while trying to judge the positions of everyone in the room. He could hear at least 2 other men moving around, likely Foster's hired guns. "Before I agree to anything," Rebecca said, her voice slightly louder than necessary, a signal Jack realized, "I want to see that your men are prepared to leave immediately." "All of them." "Of course," Foster replied smoothly. "Rogers, go get the horses ready. Johnson, check on Mathers at the back door. Make sure our exit is clear." This was their chance. As footsteps approached the kitchen door, Jack flattened himself against the wall. The moment the door opened, he brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the unsuspecting man's head. The gunman crumpled without a sound. "Now," Jack whispered to the deputies, and they burst into the dining room together. Foster stood near the front window, Rebecca seated at a table between him and another gunman. His eyes widened in shock at their sudden appearance, but he recovered quickly, grabbing Rebecca and pulling her in front of him as a shield. "Drop your weapons," he ordered, pressing a pistol to Rebecca's temple. "Or she dies right now." Jack froze, his gun half raised. The cold calculation in Foster's eyes told him this was no bluff. The man had nothing left to lose. "Let her go, Foster," Jack said, fighting to keep his voice calm despite the terror gripping him. "It's over. We know about the warrants in Boston. Marshal Dawson has sent the whole story to the territorial governor." Foster's face contorted with rage. "Then I have nothing to lose, do I? Drop the guns or I swear I'll kill her." Jack looked at Rebecca, saw the fear in her eyes but also a determination that humbled him. She gave a tiny nod, a signal he interpreted immediately. She was going to do something, and he needed to be ready. "All right," Jack said, slowly lowering his weapon. "No need for anyone to get hurt." The deputies followed his lead, placing their guns on the floor. Foster relaxed fractionally, his grip on Rebecca loosening slightly. It was all the opening she needed. In one swift motion, Rebecca drove her elbow hard into Foster's stomach. As he doubled over in pain, she tore herself from his grasp and dropped to the floor. Jack's gun was back in his hand in an instant, aimed squarely at Foster's head. "Don't move," he ordered. The remaining gunman, seeing his employer's predicament, wisely raised his hands in surrender. Foster, however, was beyond reason. With a roar of rage, he lunged toward his fallen pistol. Jack didn't hesitate. His shot caught Foster in the shoulder, spinning him away from the weapon and sending him crashing to the floor. Sheriff Taylor and Deputy Cooper burst through the front door at the sound of the shot, their guns drawn. "Everyone all right?" the sheriff called. "Fine," Jack replied, his eyes never leaving Foster as the man clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pain and fury. Foster decided to be difficult. Rebecca was already on her feet, shaken but unhurt. She moved to Jack's side, and he resisted the urge to pull her into his arms, not wanting to show such vulnerability in front of Foster. "It's over," she said softly, her hand finding his free one and squeezing it tightly. It was over. Foster and his men were taken into custody, with the wounded Foster receiving treatment from Doc Wilson before being locked securely in the jail. A telegram arrived the next day confirming that Marshal Dawson was sending deputies to escort the prisoners back to Denver, where they would face charges of fraud, arson, and attempted murder before being extradited to Boston for their earlier crimes. Judge Harmon's ruling arrived by telegram as well, a complete vindication of Rebecca's claims and a stern denunciation of Foster's fraudulent documents. The water rights of Cottonwood Creek were officially confirmed as communal, to be shared by all landowners along its course according to territorial law. In the days that followed, as Silver Creek slowly returned to normal, Jack found himself at a crossroads. The crisis had passed, but the feelings it had awakened in him remained, stronger if anything, now that the immediate danger was gone. He rode out to the site of Rebecca's burned cabin a week after Foster's arrest. The charred remains had been cleared away, leaving only the stone chimney and foundation. As he dismounted, he tried to imagine what it might look like rebuilt, a proper home with curtains at the windows and a garden out front. "I thought I might find you here." Jack turned to see Rebecca approaching on horseback, her honey-blonde hair loose around her shoulders in the afternoon sunlight. She dismounted gracefully and came to stand beside him, looking at the empty foundation. "I've been thinking about rebuilding," she said after a moment. "The town has offered to help. Mr. Baker says he owes me for standing up to Foster, since his son might have died if the truth hadn't come out." Jack nodded. "It's good land. Worth rebuilding on." "Yes," she hesitated, then turned to face him directly. "Jack, when we were in Denver and again during the confrontation with Foster, you said things about us, about a future." He had. Words spoken in moments of high emotion, when the barriers he'd maintained for so long had crumbled under the weight of his feelings for her. "I meant them," he said simply. "Did you?" Her eyes searched his face. "Because since Foster's arrest, you've been distant. I wasn't sure if perhaps you regretted what was said." Jack took a deep breath, struggling to put into words the conflict that had been tormenting him. "I don't regret it. But I'm not sure I deserve you. I've spent years avoiding connections, avoiding anything that might hurt if lost. I'm not sure I know how to be different." Rebecca stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "You already are different. The man who saw me crying in that church doorway and decided to help a stranger, that man already knew how to care, Jack. He just needed to remember." She was right, he realized. The walls he'd built after his parents' deaths had never fully extinguished the capacity for connection. They'd just contained it, like damming a river. And now that the dam had broken, the feelings flowed more powerfully than ever. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "I think I have since I first saw you. And it terrifies me, because loving someone means having something to lose again." "Yes," she agreed softly, "it does, but it also means having someone to lean on when the world turns harsh. Someone to share both burdens and joys." She took his hands in hers. "I love you too, Jack Barton, enough to risk the pain that might come with it." He pulled her gently into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. When their lips met, it was like coming home to a place he'd never been before, unfamiliar yet somehow deeply right. "Marry me," he whispered when they finally parted. "Not because of Foster or water rights or burned cabins. Just because I love you, and I don't want to spend another day of my life alone." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the eastern ridge, the view she'd described so lovingly when first telling him about her property. "Yes," she said simply, "yes." They were married 3 weeks later in the same church where Jack had first seen Rebecca crying. The entire town turned out for the celebration, along with Carlos and Elena Martinez, the Riveras, and even old Joaquin Mendoza, who presented them with a carefully preserved map showing the boundaries of Rebecca's property as they had existed under the original Spanish grant. By spring, they had rebuilt the cabin, larger than before with a proper bedroom, a study for Rebecca's schoolwork, and a wide porch facing west toward the mountains. Jack sold his small plot of land and used the money to buy cattle and horses for their ranch. Rebecca continued teaching at the Silver Creek School, riding home each afternoon to the property that had become more than just her father's legacy. It was now the foundation of a future neither of them had dared imagine. Sometimes Jack would watch her moving about their home or working in the garden they'd planted together, and marvel at how completely his life had changed. The solitude he'd once clung to as a shield now seemed like a prison escaped. The vulnerability he'd feared had become his greatest strength. "What are you thinking about?" Rebecca asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in gold and crimson. Jack smiled, pulling her closer against his side. about how wrong I was, about the frontier, about connection, about what it means to truly survive out here. And what does it mean? She asked, though her smile suggested she already knew his answer. It means this, he said, gesturing to their home, the land around them, and finally to the space between them that was no longer empty. Not just enduring alone, but building something together. Something worth fighting for. Rebecca leaned up to kiss him, her lips warm against his. I'm glad you saw me crying that day, she whispered. So am I, Jack replied, holding close the woman who had taught him that even on the harsh frontier, love wasn't a luxury but a necessity, as essential to survival as water flowing freely through the land they now shared. So am I.